Okay, welcome back to the Becoming Noble podcast. Today, by popular demand, we have my father, Grandpa Kurtz, who has agreed to come down and speak about boarding school, life in the British countryside in the 1950s and 60s. Many readers sent in questions to get a sense of the texture of what this was actually like. But Grandpa Kurtz, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's open with a story. You have many stories, and I enjoy them all very much. The first one I was going to ask about was the story about the monkey and the kestrel. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
I do, yes. Well, the matron in our school, possibly untypically, kept a monkey. And when we arrived at age 13, we went into the school refectory and there was a monkey hanging onto the curtains. And the other boys, because we were new boys and hadn't seen this before, tried to persuade us that actually it was a hallucination and that there was no monkey. And finally, when we accepted the presence of the monkey, we were told that the monkey would be beaten in place of anybody who misbehaved. That you could request that the monkey be beaten instead of you, but that this was regarded as very dishonourable.
And what was there was a kestrel development to the monkey?
Yes, well, there was a boy in the school who had a kestrel, and a fight developed between the kestrel and the monkey in the refectory, which is the cafeteria, and upsetting the people who cooked our food quite considerably.
And who got the better of this exchange?
Well, the kestrel got the better, having wings and claws, and the monkey just had a very bad temper.
All right, give us a sense of where you're talking about. So this is in the countryside, and
this is in the countryside in the north of England. We're looking at 19th century buildings, very solid, fairly cold, on a hillside, 600 boys of some civilized, some quite feral. And it was a monastic community, so the school was patrolled by monks, and again, some benevolent, some not so. And so that was and this is all in the middle of the countryside, 20 miles from the nearest large town, although there were small market towns nearby.
And everyone was Catholic. All the boys were Catholic.
All the boys were Catholic, yes.
And how did were they middle class, upper class? What were the demographics of?
There were a handful of people who were very definitely upper class, who had obviously more money than anybody else, and did things like going out to dinner on whole holidays and going out to lunch at pubs, which was way beyond the rest of us. Most of us were the children of middle-class professionals, teachers, lawyers, all of those kind of things. There were also the children of military people who were posted abroad, whose sons education was paid for by the army. And so they were the sons of diplomats, the sons of soldiers, the sons of Shell employees.
What's your sense of why most families sent their children to boarding school? Was there a deliberate Catholic community element of it, in that Catholic families were strewn around the country and had to find some kind of convening mechanism, or was it of convenience or cultural norms?
Catholics wanted their children to go to Catholic schools, but the boarding school ethos at the time was based around the idea that at a given time, probably your parents are not the best people to be educating you and bringing you up. I mean, they are in the general sense, but at the point where you become unmannerly and unruly and teenaged and all that sort of thing, it was given that most fathers were working all day, every day. It was felt that the burden of dealing with teenage children in all their stroppiness and difficulty was probably best done at a distance by somebody else.
Left to monks in the countryside.
Yes, exactly. And what could possibly go wrong?
Right. What was your room like? Tell me about the buildings. Beautiful, large, small,
Practical, capable of withstanding a moderate artillery attack, I should say. When you first went there for the first couple of years, you were in a dormitory, and dormitories had probably, 20 boys in them, 2 rows of 10 beds, and a locker for your clothes and chest of drawers. And then after the second year, you graduated to a shared room with 2 other people. And then, depending on your seniority, you went up to a shared room with 2 people. And then when you were a monitor, prefect, you had a room to yourself.
Smoking in your rooms permitted?
Smoking in your rooms permitted after you were 16, you were allowed to smoke a pipe. You were never allowed to smoke cigarettes, but obviously people did. As long as there was somebody in the room smoking a pipe, everybody else could be smoking cigarettes and blame the smoke on the pipe smoker. You were also allowed to smoke cigars in your room after 9 o'clock.
Quite cultured. Very civilized.
Should you wish to. Actually, what most people smoked most of the time was roll-ups. And
some things never change.
Some things never change. And there was a skill in rolling the thinnest, almost single strand roll-up, toothpick thin, just to make your Old Holborn or your Golden Virginia go as far as possible. And you could tell who the smokers were because they would cut pieces of potato or apple from the food at lunch and put them in their tins to keep the tobacco moist for longer.
Mm. I tried smoking a pipe once at 16. It was absolutely lethal. Pipe tobacco is bloody strong.
Yeah, but also, I blush to think how foolish we looked at 16, sitting there with our pipes, setting the world to rights. So just that it's best left to schoolmasters, pipe smoking, I think, and not embarked on as an adult pursuit.
Tolkien characters as well.
Mm.
Is it true you brewed beer in the bath?
I didn't, but there were 2 boys who had a license to brew beer, and they did so in one of the baths, which was annoying because it tended to put there were 60 boys, for which there were, I think, 4 baths. But there were showers. So bath was a luxury, but they were not baths. They were not, you wouldn't really want to drink something that had been brewed in those baths, but it was regarded as a privilege to drink the beer, which was brewed during the week and drunk at the weekend. So not really mature. And it was indescribably filthy, but it was a privilege. And so if you were, any privilege you were allowed, you took.
Do you have any slang that you remember?
Oh, tobacco was always called turban.
Etymology there being problematic.
No, it was called that. It was a mishearing of Old Holborn, and somebody had, or some kind of rhyming slang relating to Old Holborn, which was it was nothing to do with headgear.
The famous dimension of boarding school life was the beating. Was there much at that time?
Well, the thing about beating is it's a bit like a nuclear deterrent, in that authority was theoretically backed by force in the form of beating, but you had to go out of your way to earn a beating. And there were 2 kinds of beatings. Well, there are 3 kinds of beatings. There was the one given by your housemaster, which was generally on the hand with a whalebone called a ferula. And you put out your hand and you got however many whacks on the hand. Then there was a beating by the headmaster, which was quite feared, just because he was quite a shy man and didn't enjoy it. And of course, it very much
more awkward than painful.
More awkward than painful, more socially awkward. Some housemasters were much more violent beaters than others, and favoured the whack on the arse approach. And and did so quite venomously in some cases, where the boys in question had to go to the infirmary afterwards. But there was something, there was a prefect level tanning that you could get to before I went. This was banned about the time that I went, where the head of every house would be gathered in a room, and you would get one stroke from each of them, and you had to thank the prefect by name after each stroke.
Quite right.
And for reasons that I don't remember, there was a crucifix in there that was always turned to the wall when you were beaten.
Which is ironic, because it is actually a Christian direction. That spare the rod, spoil the child is a direct quotation from Psalms or Proverbs. I can't remember which one.
Yes, well, it depends on the application of the rod, rather, doesn't
it? Was there any of the classic throwing the eraser across the room?
What's that? Sorry.
You know, the whiteboard.
Oh, erasers, yes. But we didn't have, it was blackboards there and chalk. And a piece of chalk could be thrown quite hard and accurately, and usually to get the attention of a boy who had fallen asleep in class. But if you were rude to a teacher and the teacher had a temper, you might throw the board rubber, which could cause you quite a nasty blow on the head.
I remember you telling us a story a long time ago about how they sort of misconfigured the punishment regime with the effect that they ended up generating some set of hardened criminals that were both very fit because they had to get into village after dark, and very tough because they'd be punished every time they were caught.
Well, the trouble with any physical sanction, and this goes to everything from beating to interrogation, is that there comes a point where the victim is not afraid of it. And at that point came with boys who were constantly beaten. They stopped minding, or at least they found a way to deal with it. And then, and this is the trouble of any kind of regime backed by force, where do you go? So what followed had to be expulsion if they didn't learn.
Execution.
But I mean, 99% of us, believe me, did not reach that point. Nobody wanted to be beaten.
What qualified for expulsion? Did the armory story result in an expulsion?
I think it did. Yes.
Tell us about the armory, and then tell the story which resulted in the expulsion, because it's unthinkable now that a British school would have a fully armed, a fully stocked weapon closet.
There was nothing unusual about that, about having an armory, and this was an armory which was stocked with 2.2 range accuracy rifles and 303 infantry rifles. It was actually a lot of fun, target shooting, and although the targets were, of course, charging Germans. But there was a story that happened before I went, which was that a boy started firing at his housemaster. He somehow got a 303 out of the armory, and a pocket full of rounds, and at a range of about 400 or 500 yards started shooting at his housemaster, who had been in the army and was a monk, and stood his ground. And 3 shots were fired, each getting closer, and he didn't move, and he stood there and he said, "That boy, you come and see me." And I think that's kind of level of activity was expulsion.
It's quite different to when I was in school. We had CCF, which for Americans is Combined Cadet Forces. It's the sort of youth arm of the military that they train you in when you're a teenager to prepare you for actual military service if you're interested. And I thought there'd be a lot of that, because we had a sort of little military depot thing in our school. I thought it would be armed. I presumed it would be armed. So I signed up when I was 13, and I discovered they didn't have any weapons, and they basically did no weapons training whatsoever. It was just marching round and round in parade, in drill, in the playground.
Yes, that's boring.
So I quit a week later, and the guy that ran it, I forgot what we called him. There was a name. He had a name, which was, the commandant or whatever. And he called me a word that I cannot repeat in this podcast studio as a 13-year-old. a word which begins with F. So
for
not sticking with his regime, which I'm sure I deserve. But did you have a common room?
Every house had a common room. Yes. It was just a room with a piano and copies of the Daily Express and stuff, and an altar at the other end because it doubled as the house chapel.
Was there like a common room culture? I mean, I remember in our common room, we, to the school's great dismay, developed a chanting culture, and certain boys, unforgivably, as the inevitable targets of bullying, but sort of loving bullying. Not all these boys were hated or tortured, but certain boys had songs about them which were incredibly rude and filthy and insulted their sisters and everything under the sun. And every so often, if you dropped something, everyone would go crazy and start banging on the tables and shrieking until the poor tuck shop lady, who was the only adult who was allowed in there, sort of started sobbing, and then we'd sort of calm down and try to make her happy again.
Well, there wasn't a certain amount of that, but there are two schools. You were at prep school from 7 or 8 until 12, and then from 13 to 17 or 18 you were at public school, and the setup was fairly different in both. By the time you were at public school, you were regarded as somebody who was capable of more or less regulating your behaviour. If you wanted to shout and fight, then that was not the place to do it, because it was right next to the housemaster's study, and you'd get into trouble. And actually, prep school was much more full of fights and blood and wounds than public school was. By the time they got to public school, most boys were disinclined to fight, and we had plenty of sports that we didn't particularly enjoy but were forced to do that kind of wore you out. So we weren't going around like sort of primed grenades. We were exhausted and hungry most of the time.
Was there a two-tier system of law? So was there the sort of official school law enforced by the limited number of monks, and then the unofficial code of omerta amongst the boys? Because presumably you had fairly free reign over a large swathe of land.
We did, but everybody who went to public school had been to prep school first. And actually the rules by which schoolboys operate were established in your first week, practically in your first day that you arrived age 7 or 8 at your first boarding school. And those rules were, let me see. Yes, I remember a friend of mine being told, practically on arrival, there are 3 things you have to know. Don't swank, don't sneak, and don't blub. So don't boast about any wealth your parents might have or any achievements that you might consider that you yourself have got. Don't never tell on anybody ever, and never cry. And those are the 3 pillars of prep school behaviour.
I think those are Jordan Peterson's 12 rules for life.
Are they?
No, but they should be. There's another sex missing from this story. Were there girls ever in the lives of men before the age of 18?
Well, that wholly depended. There were in the holidays for some people, but it depend if you had sisters and a social life, which some people did, and there was a huge disparity in the kind of social sophistication of the boys then. In that, as I said, some had sisters, they went to parties, they knew, they had wide circles of acquaintance. The great disadvantage of going away to boarding school is that your friends all live at the other end of the country, so you never see them in the holidays. And so you're very much thrust on your own resources. I certainly didn't have no social life, no parties, nothing of that sort. It just wasn't. It just wasn't part of my life.
Well, you lived in the countryside,
and I lived in the countryside, a long way from towns,
yeah.
And so I just did countryside things.
Did you have what we had, which were? I enjoyed boys' school greatly. I was very sad when they converted my school into a mixed school, because there was a certain culture that just couldn't survive contact with girls, because boys, they self-organize in a way when they've got no one to impress, and as soon as they've got someone to impress, there's much more swanking, as you would put it, than there would be otherwise. But did you have those excruciating dances we had with?
They were really excruciating, and equally so, probably more so for the unfortunate girls. It was always billed. A notice would go up that there would be a dance against a given girl's school.
Versus, yeah.
And on the appointed night, coaches would arrive. We'd all be kind of craning out the window in sort of fascination and dread as these exotic creatures from some convent got out. And then the whole thing it was unbelievably grim, would happen in gymnasium or something, and the girls would be drawn up on one side and the boys on the other, and there would be representatives from the girls' school, not quite with a whistle, but almost.
Yeah. Well, who better to watch you dance with a girl than both nuns and monks?
No, I mean, the whole thing was just indescribably ghastly for everybody involved.
What kind of boys made it? Were there any boys that just it didn't suit the boarding school life whatsoever?
Yeah, boys were running away quite often, and usually it depended. People who ran away either did so for an adventure, in other words, just to go down to London or whatever for the weekend, or go to a pop concert or something, or they ran away because they were disturbed and unhappy, or being bullied, or just hated the whole thing. And actually, in truth, the authorities were good at knowing the difference between cases that could be solved by a beating and those which required sympathy. Talking about girls, I mean, no, there were never girls in the school, and we never saw any. But the system depended in a way on an understanding of the unspoken rules of the schoolboy at the time, which absolutely wouldn't have been shared by schoolgirls. And it was as rigid as any kind of social structure anywhere. For example, if you were going to fight somebody, then there were very definite limitations on what you could do. You couldn't punch in the face or the balls. You couldn't kick. So, in effect, what you were limited to doing was a kind of wrestling. Both parties got it out of their system, and neither party was probably injured. Not worse than a sort of bloody nose. I mean, I was thinking about this when we were talking about it earlier. In fact, if you leave young people to organise themselves, if you trust them, they will probably do it reasonably efficiently. And the rules of all these things, how you had to fight, what was allowed to happen, what wasn't, etc., have been established by previous generations of schoolboys and handed down. We weren't making it up for ourselves. These were age-burnished rules of fighting, and there were also games where one gang would defend a fort and the others would attack it, and there were definite limitations on. You could throw stuff and you could fight, but there were limitations on what you could throw. So, a flint the size of your fist you couldn't, but sort of smaller stuff that would intimidate or scratch or whatever was okay. And the staff kind of knew that there would be amongst the boys people who would stop things ever really getting out of hand. And everything changes when you've got somebody there issuing orders saying you can't do this, you can't do that. I mean, yes, you get order of a certain kind, but you get an intimidated order.
And was there, within the boys, was there deference to the older boys? Like, was the prefect just an official position, or was it an unofficial position of respect within the hierarchy?
Deference was one. Yes, I mean, you had to be deferential to the prefects because they had it in their power to make life very difficult for you if you weren't. But people could win respect by being sports heroes, by being clever, charming, fashionable.
Growing a moustache.
Growing a moustache, no, very few people were able to do that. But people who were, for example, good debaters, good at art, were respected. It wasn't uncool to be clever. And people who were good actors, obviously people who were good at rugby and athletics and all of that sort of thing did well. And you could, basically everybody who was, there were loads of people who were studious and good at physics who would have given it all away to be on the rugby team. Anybody who was on one of the school teams, definitely was able to walk with a certain swagger.
Did you just play other Catholic schools? Did you play Protestant schools as well?
No, all sorts of schools. Yeah.
Did you play rugby?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was similar by my time. I remember at one point, in terms of playground games, I mean, there were all the British classics, British Bulldog and probably Manhunt, and that might have been a later development, but I'm sure it was many of the same games. But at one point in junior school, we found a room full of barrels that had been there for some reason. And these barrels were unused, so we took them out. And the school teachers saw this, but I think they were sort of shrugging their shoulders, thinking, what's the worst that can happen if they roll around in some barrels? And a child got run over very quickly and broke his arm by 3 children sitting on a barrel going down a hill. And so there was some excruciating apology that had to happen to parents as they explained, we allowed these 8-year-old boys to throw themselves around hills in wine barrels. But it was fairly chaotic even then. Once we moved into the city, which we did when I was 13, that all very much went away, which was a shame.
Well, I think the thing to remember is that in the 50s and 60s, everybody's parents had been involved and affected in some way by the war that finished in 1945. Most parents had fought. So the idea that we were doing risky activities was not frowned on. So, for example, boys were allowed to climb trees and without unsupervised. And so what actually happened was that experienced boys would keep an eye on less experienced boys and take them up the higher trees, show them the way to do it. And again, left to ourselves, there was this kind of self-regulation. I mean, it worked well. I remember there was one boy who broke his leg falling out of a tree, but one in 4 or 5 years I was at the school, and that was you were once you were 10, you were allowed to climb trees, and any tree you could, and if you were any tree you were brave enough to do, and it would be unsupervised too.
Yeah,
I mean, now that would be a kind of health and safety nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, there are some jolly tall trees in the English countryside, chestnuts and oaks.
Trees. Yeah.
You were on the boxing. You did boxing? You were on the boxing team?
I did boxing, yes.
Yeah. It's not taught in schools anymore.
Really?
I mean, I don't think so. You can do boxing at a club, but there was certainly no option to do it at my school, where normally there would have been. You could do all kinds of strange competitive sports, which the less athletic boys would seek out to try and get out of doing athletics or whatever. But boxing was not on the menu.
Well, I think boxing was... The schools liked boxing because boxing was, the children who wanted to do it enjoyed it, but actually it was a chance for the teachers to teach ritual and behaviour, and because boxing is very codified, and the intention is not that people should get damaged, but that it should be a sport.
Yeah, I used to fence, and that one of the nice legacy elements that was preserved was that it was still expected that you'd salute your opponent before every match. Do you have uniforms? What were the aesthetics of everyday life?
The aesthetics of everyday life were, at prep school, you had corduroy shorts, grey sweater, school tie, cap sometimes. Public school, we were allowed to wear clothes provided they fell within a certain range of respectability. Sports jackets, blazers, flannel trousers, etc. And if you had won a tie, for example, for running or for athletics or something like that, you could wear that.
How did you actually get to boarding school? Did you take the train, or because I remember there's that scene in Tom Brown's School Days, which is it's an oddly written book because it's written in the 1850s or something, but a third of the book is just his carriage journey to the school.
Yeah, I mean those schools had school trains which were specially requisitioned, and they would be full of boys travelling from London to wherever their schools were. There was a very kind of strange atmosphere because you were not at the school, but you were technically under the control of the school. And so there was a sort of license where people did drink and smoke, and a sort of blind eye was turned to it. Actually, you weren't allowed to smoke because for safety reasons, but people did drink, and they did wear. It was a tradition to wear outlandish clothes on the school train that you were then not going to be allowed to wear at the school. So you were in this kind of hinterland between holidays and school. The atmosphere was slightly hysterical. You knew you were going to be banged up for the next 3 months.
I remember, maybe this is just a sort of fond memory. It feels like England used to be colder. Do you know what I mean? Like the snows in the countryside used to be deeper.
It was colder. It was definitely colder, and I remember winters where the snow would be there for 3 months in one case without thawing. You didn't always get a white Christmas, but you usually got some snow, and serious snow that would go up to your knees in the countryside and was good enough for sledging down hills on. I mean, all of that is a thing of the past completely. And I don't know whether the summers were nicer, longer, sunnier. They seemed that way.
Did you have, do you remember any really absurd rules or eccentric, crazy teachers?
Well, there were always teachers who had, sooner or later, there would be boys who were expert at winding up teachers, who, by a slow, steady process, would wind a teacher up into an ungovernable rage, where they would almost lose control of themselves, and by a very precise kind of almost skillful kind of probing and needling, and asking of ridiculous but legal questions. And eventually we had young masters who would, they were probably under 20 in a lot of cases. And they were not used to this at all. They'd been handing it out themselves 5 years earlier. They would lose control, and then, of course, all respect would go out of the window. But they were quite eccentric people, because for the most part, prep school teachers lived in the school. So they were people who were unmarried. They probably lived with their parents the rest of the time. These kind of figures there were much more of them then. A lot of men damaged by the war, people who had fought. And to qualify for being a master in a prep school was pretty much anyone prepared to do the job, I think.
Yeah.
So you got some pretty strange people, and some, of course, brilliant people too, but eccentric people.
In our day, it was the maths and physics teachers that got by far the worst of it. They were judged to be the softest targets. I remember it was the same thing of like not crossing the line, but seeing how far the line would be pushed. I remember one time with a, in retrospect, very sweet maths teacher, we simply just locked the door before he entered the room, and there was a window on the door so he could see us, and we sat very calmly and all faced the front, and everyone appeared to be patiently waiting for the lesson to start, but the room was clearly locked, and he was sort of shaking it more and more violently until there was a whole gang of maths teachers on the other side of the door trying to break it down without looking like they were trying to break down a door in the middle of school hours.
Well, they used to say boys will be boys, but actually, I mean, the truth is that boys were in some senses savages, and in some senses very civilized. There was a lot that was very primitive about boarding schools, but there was a lot that worked too, in that it made friendships of the sort that you only make in adversity, I think, by people who are undergoing an extremely strange experience alongside you.
Sort of military style brotherhood.
It, in a sense, it's, but it wasn't so much the hardship was not so much physical. There was a lot of, I mean, if you imagine a school full of boys, 10 or 12 boys coming each year, aged 7, to board for the next 3 months, most of whom had never been away from home. There was a lot that was unspoken that you shared with the other people. That they were, a lot of them, to begin with, lonely and unhappy, and it was only when they got to know each other. So your kind of emotional survival was in the hands of your friends. And although obviously these things were never discussed or never put into words, but the idea that we were always savage was not true. There was a lot of compassion and mercy in the children that we were, which is never said, but the place wouldn't have worked. No such institution would have worked if we hadn't supported each other.
It sounds, again, it's difficult to know what is overly fond recollection and what is actually the truth. But my memory of boys' school was of one which is very similar to what you're describing, which is, although there were very clear cliques and a sort of hierarchy between, the bigger, more aggressive boys and then the obviously sort of softer, nerdier types, there was never open antagonism, and there were fights, of course, and there was a specific designated place for fights all the way at the back of the school on the furthest back grounds. But it was a fairly sort of controlled affair. It was limited warfare rather than total war. And I do remember that changing when the girls joined. There does seem to be some kind of stasis or natural equilibrium that occurs in an all-male environment.
Yes, I mean, it. All I can say is that it worked most of the time. There was a lot that you could do that you could never do at home. There were a lot of elaborate adventures that you could have that you would never have if you were going home at tea time.
Yeah,
every day. And the sense of doom at the beginning of the term with 3 months to go was great, but also the sense of going home for the holidays was concomitantly thrilling.
Did you ever sneak out after dark or conduct pranks or anything of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody did. People would, because there was a dormitory. Most of the dormitories, in fact, all of the dormitories, when I think about it, had fire escapes. That was compulsory even then. Some of the fire escapes were wholly unreliable death trap things, which is essentially a rope on a pulley that you were supposed to put under your arms and then launch yourself out of the window. Whether you would survive that, I doubt. But the first floor dormitories had actual fire escapes that you could climb out of, and so of course we opened the windows and climbed out onto the fire escapes and roamed the grounds at night. Very much a beatable offence. I do still remember the sensation of being in the school grounds in the gardens wearing pyjamas and dressing gown at 3 o'clock in the morning, light of the moon. I mean, they were completely pointless, these things, but you get up and you go into the grounds and sit round and eat a Mars bar or something. I mean, just because you could.
Were there agreed meeting points, like a grotto or a...
Well, there was very much a kind of competition for how far you could get before you came back to the dormitory. And some boys went, over a mile, which was by road and things. God knows what would have happened if police had come along. But so it was... I mean, I never got particularly far, but some very daring boys did get quite far, and you had to kind of come back with something to prove you had done it.
What was the food like?
Oh, unspeakable. The things that were nice, I remember, were not the cooked things. What schools had, what prep schools had in the 50s, were special food that was designated for schools, which was sold in huge quantities, so hundredweights of dried fruit, which was just absolutely disgusting. Although the original fruits, apricots and stuff, prunes, lots of prunes, were probably quite nice. By the time they'd been dried, left in a warehouse for 5 years and then rehydrated and heated up and put on a plate with lumpy custard. I mean, just disgusting. Stews in greasy yellow gravy. Tea was probably the best meal, because at tea you would get chocolate fingers or marshmallows or stuff that, came out of a packet. So it was obviously better.
Yeah. It was the same story at our school. The only prized possession in the food hall was, once a week there'd be jellies. And you're only allowed one dessert. You're only allowed one jelly. And the lunch ladies knew us well, since we were a limited caste, so you couldn't go twice. And this resulted in a sort of mafia arrangement where one boy would find out ways to exert leverage on other boys to go and collect him a jelly. And this resulted once in my friend Chris, who he ate 16 jellies and then threw up pure jelly on the floor of the lunch hall. A sort of because they were all different colours, so it was just a truly terrible sight watching Chris collapse on the floor in a pool of jelly. But
well, there was a luxury at public school that most days we had porridge to start with, which was again just filthy gruel that you wouldn't want to eat, and I never did. But a couple of days a week we had cornflakes, and these would be, the bowls would be filled with cornflakes and put in our places. Everybody in the house would come up from prayers to see that it was a cornflakes day, which was a big deal. And everybody knew on the cornflakes day, we were encouraged to stay down and say our own prayers after the service. But everybody knew that if you didn't hurry upstairs, then the first people to get into the dining hall would run around taking fists full of cornflakes from other people's bowls and adding them to their own. So if you were late, or if you kind of stopped to commune with your maker, then you'd get there and there would just be 5 or 6 cornflakes at the bottom of the bowl.
The situation's bad when cornflakes are the luxury. Do you know how cornflakes came to be? Kellogg was a Puritan and was very interested in different strategies which would sort of tamp down the passions of young men.
Yeah.
And his belief was that the plainer foods would encourage the passions to be restrained more so. I mean, it's actually a sort of traditional Christian thing. It's why you're not supposed to eat meat on Fridays. It inflames the passions.
Oh, okay. Right.
But
Okay.
yeah,
Bear
when
that in
cornflakes
mind.
are your great luxury,
Yeah, they were a complete luxury. Yeah.
what was the faith life like? Presumably this was pre full. It would have been post Vatican II, but pre Vatican II implementation. So you still would have had Latin Mass, right?
Yes. When was by the late by sort of 66, 67, we're starting to have English Mass. But until that date, it was, well, let me get this right. I think Vatican II was 65, was it?
Well, there's the pre-62 Missal, which is the one that was phased out. So it was around that period, yeah, sort of early mid-60s.
Mm. But I remember even at age 10 or 11, everybody knew the Latin off by heart. Even if you didn't know what it meant, you knew the words of the Mass, all of the words of the Mass off by heart. Again, if you did Latin, you understood some of it. But mostly they were it was sounds and ritual. And then once it was translated, the translations, the early I don't know if they've got better. There's no reason to suppose they have. The early translations were very lumpen, awful, kind of jargony, unsatisfactory, and any sense of religiosity was vanished. And actually, although we didn't understand most of the Latin, the English translations were themselves so far from the English that we used every day that they meant nothing to us.
Yeah.
They were incomprehensible.
You had daily Mass?
No, we didn't. We had Mass, I think it was about on Sunday, and 2 days of the week there was a full Mass. This was at prep school, and the other days there was just prayers. And at public school there was Mass on, I think, Wednesdays and on Sundays.
Was there a spectrum of boys? Was anyone sort of taken in by it, as it were? Did everyone regard it as a chore, or were there people for whom it was clearly a...
No, it was... no, I don't remember. I mean, yes, if you wanted to do other things, but it was so much part of the fabric of life that it wasn't regarded as something that there was any option about. And I mean, that this is another thing, that when you make things optional, then you introduce a kind of dissatisfaction that we probably didn't have because things seemed immutable. The idea that you could not go to Mass because you were not feeling like it, or tired or anxious or something, rightly or wrongly, that was just not on the cards. If you were going to miss Mass, it was because you were actually in bed with a certified illness that the matron with the monkey had actually rubber stamped. But apart from that, so you don't really feel resentful about something that is as immutable as that.
Yeah, I think that's one, because there's a sense, among my generation, and it's probably true of myself as well, that one of the attractions of the Latin Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, is its uncompromising nature, and one of the effects of the changes brought about by Vatican II, in which the Mass was attempted to be transformed to become more open and inviting and so forth, is that pliability was introduced. And as soon as the pliability is introduced, you have something to sort of pull against, and you feel like it's a less, you're not getting that kind of structure and hardness and solidity that a young man craves, an almost military-like discipline with regards to, these are the movements, this is the liturgy, this is the sequence of events, this is the choreography.
The sense that we got was that we knew perfectly well that Catholicism was uncompromising, that it was different. It had different rules to the way that other people lived their lives. And there was a sense that what happened from the late 60s was that actually there was an attempt to kind of groove it up, to sell it back to us as something more liberal than it was, because it didn't fundamentally change, but the style changed, and it kind of got, as I said, I mean, you know, it tried to meet us halfway, and actually we didn't expect to be met halfway. That's not whether you loved it or whether you hated it. It was rather like the rules that were introduced to schools at the time. They felt that the schools were too stuck in the 50s. And so they said, oh, well, you can wear different things, you can play your music. In other words, what they did was that what we actually objected to about the whole thing, in so much as we objected, was the fact that you were taken away from your home to an institution at the other end of the country and made to follow orders for 3 months at a time. So whether you were following those orders in a tie of your own choosing or not, really was neither here nor there. So the trouble with the liberalizations were that you can't really liberalize a boarding school. A boarding school is a boarding school, and if you're not happy because you're boarding, no changing of the style is going to alter that. If you don't like Catholicism, then having it in English is not going to make you like it anymore.
Yeah.
You know, these are uncompromising institutions. Liberalizing them on the surface simply made us all distrust the institutions.
Zizek, do you remember Slavoj Zizek? Yeah. He has this comment about parenting, which sort of applies, which is that in the old system, it was actually freer, although it had the appearance of being more authoritarian, because you would just tell children to do things, and there was an implicit threat of force behind all, you know, behavior and misbehavior. And so the child would know what it had to do, but in its own mind it could rebel. And whereas now, with this sort of gentle parenting style, parents attempt to convince or teach their children to do everything and not apply pressure. And the actual effect of that is the child still doesn't want to do it. It's just they're subject to this sort of emotional manipulation that they're very conscious of. And they're being told, you don't just have to do this, you have to want to do it. There's no room for rebellion in your own mind.
Yeah. Notions of liberalization that are poorly thought out just impose anxiety on the people that they're supposed to reassure.
Okay, I remember a story about a prank involving a plane.
Yes, well, this was the CCF that you were referring to, the Combined Cadet Force. For reasons that I can't remember, I was placed in the RAF section. And one of the activities that we were required to do was there was a glider which was operated by a propeller which was made to turn by an enormous elastic band which was wound up by the boys. One boy would sit in the cockpit. Everybody else would wind up the elastic band. Then it would be pushed down a hill. The boy would be instructed to pull back the joystick, and the thing would hopefully take off and go for 50 yards through the air and then limp to a safe conclusion. There was a boy in my house who was mechanically minded and quite diabolical. And what he did was he moved the, just before the takeoff, he took out the thing that stopped the joystick going back.
The limiter, yeah.
Yes, the limiter to stop it stalling. And so the elastic band, which was, as thick as your leg, was wound up. Some unfortunate was strapped into the cockpit. And then we were told to push, and so we pushed, and the glider gathered speed down the hill, and the officer in charge said, pull, meaning pull the joystick, and the boy in it did it, and instead of rising elegantly into the air, the glider went nose upwards, stalled immediately, crashed, both wings fell off. The boy was dragged out with only minor injuries.
How old was this boy?
15.
Yeah.
But it was regarded as a, thoroughly well spent afternoon.
Do you want to tell the story of my aunt, your sister, in the confessional?
Oh yes. Well, that's
it's a family legendary story.
It is a family legend. I went with my sister to confession in a local church. Just before us, a boys' school had been doing a kind of bulk confession. And I went in and I did mine, and then my sister went in. And the priest said to her, now you may be concerned about some changes that have been occurring in your body. He said, don't worry, you're turning into a man.
Yeah. That was an excruciating. If there was one negative part of Catholic schooling, especially in the age of mandatory sexual education by the government, being delivered mandatory government-defined sexual education by a Catholic priest was a truly awful experience.
Yes. Yeah. No. That I don't think has changed since 1st century AD.
Tell my listeners what trepanning is.
What trepanning is?
Yeah, and because you I believe had a visitor which had.
Well, that was. Yes, well, this was at prep school. We had, at prep school, we used to have people who used to come and lecture on a Sunday evening on all sorts of subjects, from Red Indians, as they called them. There was a man who dressed up as one, who I think came from Birmingham. And there was another man who lectured on badgers, and there was a man who came who lectured on deep sea diving, and he had been trepanned, which was a treatment given to people who were suffering from mental stress, which involved drilling holes into their skulls, which was supposed to relieve the pressure. And I mean, in some cases did, and in many cases, I think it simply involved taking a Black & Decker to somebody.
And you had a permanent hole in your skull from then on.
Well, I didn't, but he did. He had 3 holes. And he had come from a long way to the school to lecture to us on underwater. He was concerned with underwater wrecks and diving and things like that. And to our horror, we discovered that when he had stayed the night, he had bled from the holes in his skull onto a pillow that had to be burned.
But I mean, so in the sort of Western medical tradition, it was an attempt at treatment. But my understanding is that it became briefly popular in the mid-20th century because it was discovered that Cossacks did it for sort of spiritual reasons, to commune with the spirits. And there was a sort of New Age movement of people trepanning themselves. It became like a voluntary procedure.
Yeah, well, yes, I don't think he had done this to himself. He may have done this to himself. Anything was possible. I think he had it done as part of some misplaced treatment to relieve some mania he had. Trepanning kind of comes and goes as a fad, and it seems horrific to most of us, but it seems to make perfect sense to some people. And auto-trepanning with an electric drill.
You better keep your head steady.
I think we were rather just horrified by the idea of that whatever had come out of his head during the course of the night meant that the pillow had to be burned.
All right, let's finish with the story of you translated once at a conference with Gaddafi in attendance, no?
Yes, I did.
And he brought his retinue and bodyguard with him.
Yes, he did. And both Gaddafi and Castro were speaking at this conference. Gaddafi had this kind of kick line of women who he brought with him, who were in very tight uniforms and boots, who did this kind of routine on stage before he went on. It was very, very peculiar and rather fetishistic.
But they were his personal guard. He famously only had 50 female bodyguards.
Did he?
I believe so.
Well, this was the pick of the crop.
You had the honor of and they brought weapons to the conference.
You weren't strictly allowed weapons in the conference. You had to leave them at the airport. But if you could persuade the authorities that the weapons were more ornamental than practical. So a grenade launcher, certainly not. But
this was in Africa.
No, yes, it was in Africa.
Yeah.
But a pearl handle revolver, for example, was just a personal.
Yeah, it's just dressing well.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was
great
fun.
Pleasure.
Yeah. The reason I had so many questions is that the audience sent in many, so this will be greatly enjoyed, I'm sure.
I hope so.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much.
Pleasure.